Story number 1. The Skier in the Shadows. Breckenridge is the kind of place where the snow seems endless, where the mountains loom like ancient gods, and the air carries a kind of magic that keeps people coming back year after year. For me, it was supposed to be an escape, a solo trip to clear my head after a rough breakup and the endless grind of city life. I wanted quiet, snow, and the rush of carving down the slopes. But instead, I found something I can't explain, something I'll never forget. It started innocently enough. I arrived at the lodge late in the evening. The warmth of the roaring fire in the lobby a welcome reprieve from the biting cold outside. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a broad smile, handed me my room key and a trail map. "You'll love it here," he said. "Plenty of runs for all skill levels. But maybe avoid East Ridge after sunset." I frowned. "Why?" His smile faltered slightly. "Just a local superstition. People say it's different up there at night." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to add some mystery to my trip. But as I settled into my room, unpacking my gear, I couldn't shake the way his voice had dropped, as if he really believed what he was saying. The next day was perfect. Blue skies, powdery snow, and the kind of crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. I spent the morning exploring the trails, gradually working my way up to the more challenging runs. By late afternoon, my legs were burning, but I wasn't ready to call it a day. The mountain was quieter now, most skiers heading back to the lodge as the sun dipped lower. That's when I saw it on the map, East Ridge. The receptionist's words echoed in my mind, but I shrugged them off. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and besides, the idea of having a run all to myself was too tempting to resist. The lift up to East Ridge was old, its wooden seats creaking as they swung in the wind. As I ascended, the sun disappeared behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow. By the time I reached the top, the mountain was bathed in twilight, the sky a deep indigo. I was alone. The trail was narrow, flanked by tall evergreens that seemed to press in on either side. The snow sparkled under the fading light, untouched and pristine. I adjusted my goggles, took a deep breath, and pushed off. The first few turns were exhilarating, the rush of the cold air against my face wiping away any lingering unease. But as I rounded a bend, something caught my eye, a figure standing still in the distance. He was dressed in old-fashioned ski gear, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the early days of the sport. His jacket was faded, his goggles round and reflective. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there, his skis angled in a perfect V. "Hello," I called out, my voice carrying across the snow. He didn't respond. I hesitated for a moment before continuing down the slope. But as I skied past him, he moved, smoothly, almost too smoothly. He turned and began following me. At first, I thought it was just another skier enjoying the trail. But something about the way he moved was wrong. His turns were too precise, too mechanical, like he wasn't bound by the same laws of gravity and friction as the rest of us. I picked up speed, the thrill of the run replaced by a growing sense of unease. He stayed right behind me, always at the same distance, no matter how fast I went or how sharply I turned. His presence was oppressive, a weight that pressed against my chest with every passing second. The bottom of the trail came into view, a wide clearing that marked the end of the run. I pushed harder, desperate to reach it, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I skidded to a stop, panting and shaking, I turned to confront him, and he was gone. I stared back up the trail, expecting to see him cresting the final hill. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the fading light and the faint whisper of the wind. Then I looked down. His ski tracks ended a few feet away from me, cutting off abruptly as if he'd vanished into thin air. The snow beyond was untouched, pristine and smooth. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, the cold air burning my throat. I looked around wildly, half expecting him to appear out of the shadows. But the mountain was empty, silent. I didn't sleep that night, back at the lodge. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the fading light and my tired mind. But the receptionist's words kept coming back to me, along with the image of those tracks, ending in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, I asked around, careful not to sound like I was losing it. Most people dismissed it as fatigue or overexertion. But one older man at the bar looked at me with a knowing expression. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. "Who?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The old skier," he said, leaning closer. "They say he died up there decades ago, caught in an avalanche on East Ridge. But he never left. He's still looking for something, or someone." I left Breckenridge the next day, cutting my trip short. Even now, months later, I can't forget the way he moved, the way his tracks ended in the middle of the snow. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see him standing there, his reflective goggles hiding whatever haunted expression lay beneath. I don't know what he wanted, but I'm not sure I want to find out. The mountains may be beautiful, but they hold their secrets tightly, and some things are better left buried in the snow. Story number 2. The shadow in the snow. I've always loved the mountains. There's a kind of purity up there, an untouched stillness that makes you feel like you're standing at the edge of the world. The San Juan Mountains, with their jagged peaks and endless expanses of snow, were my sanctuary. I'd spent countless weekends hiking, climbing, and camping there, alone with the wilderness and my thoughts. But after what happened last winter, I'm not sure I'll ever go back. It started as a solo expedition, just me and my gear, aiming to reach a ridge I'd been dreaming about for years. The forecast was clear, the air crisp, and the snow firm under my boots. I felt invincible as I made my way up the mountain, the world falling away below me with every step. The first 2 days were uneventful. I moved steadily upward, pausing only to set up camp and admire the sweeping views. By the third day, I was nearing the ridge. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a biting wind had picked up, but I pressed on, determined to reach my goal. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found a small rock overhang that offered some shelter from the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I set up my bivy sack, lit my small camping stove, and prepared a quick meal. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels alive, pressing against your ears. Then, just as I was settling in for the night, I heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the stillness, so deep it felt like the ground itself was trembling. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. Came again, closer this time, reverberating through the cold night air. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my heart pounding as I scanned the darkness. The beam of light illuminated the snow and rocks around me, but there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of white, broken only by the shadowy outlines of the trees in the distance. I told myself it was just my imagination, the sound of the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The growl came again in the middle of the night, dragging me from a restless sleep. This time, it was accompanied by a soft crunching sound. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the frozen silence. My pulse raced as I sat up, clutching the knife in my trembling hand. The footsteps stopped just outside the overhang. I held my breath, the air so cold it burned my lungs. Slowly, I turned my head toward the entrance, and that's when I saw it. A figure loomed in the darkness, massive and motionless. It was covered in thick, matted fur, its shoulders broad enough to block out the faint glow of the moon. Its eyes reflected the light of my dying fire, 2 pinpricks of amber that seemed to pierce straight through me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. I didn't move, couldn't. My body was frozen with a primal fear I'd never experienced before. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and then let out a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down my spine. I don't know how long we stayed like that, seconds, minutes, an eternity. Finally, turned and walked away, its enormous form disappearing into the night. The snow crunched beneath its feet, the sound fading until there was only silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the overhang, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The snow outside was undisturbed, except for a set of footprints. They were massive, at least twice the size of my own, with deep impressions that suggested an incredible weight. The tracks led away from the overhang, winding through the trees and into the dense forest beyond. I stared at them, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. For a moment, I considered following them, driven by a morbid curiosity to see where they led. But the memory of those amber eyes stopped me. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to meet it again. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the long descent down the mountain. Every sound, every shadow, set my nerves on edge. I didn't stop until I reached the base, my legs aching and my lungs burning. When I told the locals what I'd seen, most of them laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But a few older folks gave me knowing looks, their expressions dark. "Sounds like you met the old one," one man said, his voice low. "They've been up there as long as anyone can remember. Best to leave them be." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked away. Even now, months later, I can't shake the image of that figure standing outside the overhang, its amber eyes glowing in the darkness. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think I can hear that low, rumbling growl in the distance, a reminder that the mountains hold secrets we may never understand. I haven't been back to the San Juans since, but part of me knows that if I ever do, the old one will be waiting. Story number 3. The song Beneath the Ice. There's something about winter that feels older than time itself. The biting cold, the stillness, the way sound seems to carry forever and yet vanish into the ether. When my friends and I decided to camp near Bear Lake that December, I thought I understood the allure of the season, but I didn't understand the warnings. Not then. It was Jack's idea. He'd grown up hearing about the beauty of Bear Lake in winter, the way the snow blanketed the surrounding pines, the ice reflecting the stars like a sheet of black glass. It was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to escape the city and connect with the wild. Jack, his girlfriend Emma, my best friend Dave, and I packed up our gear and set off for a weekend we thought we'd never forget. We were right, just not in the way we expected. The hike to the campsite was uneventful. The air was crisp and cold, the snow crunching underfoot as we made our way along the trail. The lake appeared suddenly, a vast expanse of ice bordered by dark trees. It was stunning, the kind of beauty that stops you in your tracks. But even then, something about it felt wrong. The silence was too deep, the air too heavy. I shrugged it off as my imagination. We set up camp a few hundred yards from the lake. The tents huddled together like islands in a sea of white. By the time the fire was roaring, the sky had turned an inky black, the stars impossibly bright. We drank hot cocoa, told stories, and laughed, the cold forgotten in the warmth of friendship. Around midnight, the laughter faded. That's when we heard it. It started softly, a faint melody carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the whistle of the breeze through the trees, but then the notes became clearer. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing something low and mournful. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded, straining to listen. The song seemed to come from the direction of the lake, the notes rising and falling in a haunting cadence. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange clarity, as if it were meant just for us. Jack grabbed a flashlight. "Let's check it out." "Are you serious?" Dave asked, his face pale. "It's freezing, and that's probably just the wind." Jack ignored him, already heading toward the lake. Emma and I followed reluctantly, and after a moment, Dave sighed and trudged after us. The snow crunched loudly under our boots, the sound jarring against the eerie quiet. When we reached the edge of the lake, the song stopped. The ice stretched out before us, smooth and black, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Jack stepped onto the ice, his flashlight beam sweeping across its surface. "Be careful," Emma said, her voice tight. "I'm fine," Jack replied. "The ice is solid." He took another step, and that's when we saw it, a faint ripple beneath the surface, as if something large had moved just under the ice. We froze, staring at the spot. The ripple disappeared, but the ice groaned softly, a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Maybe we should go back," I said, my voice trembling. But before we could move, the song started again. It was louder this time, and closer, as if the singer were directly beneath our feet. The melody was achingly sad, filled with a longing that made my chest ache. And then the ice cracked. A thin fracture spiderwebbed out from where Jack stood, the sound sharp and sudden. He jumped back, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. The ripple returned, moving faster now, circling beneath the ice like a predator sizing up its prey. "Run!" Emma screamed, grabbing Jack's arm. We bolted back to the shore, the ice groaning behind us. The song grew louder, almost frantic, the notes twisting into something that sounded like a wail. By the time we reached the snow, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We didn't stop running until we reached the campfire. Huddled together, we stared at the lake, half expecting something to emerge from its icy depths. But the surface was still, the song gone. "What the hell was that?" Dave asked, his voice shaking. Jack didn't answer. He was staring at the lake, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "There was something under the ice," he finally said. "I saw it." We didn't sleep that night. The fire burned low, the shadows around us growing longer as the hours crawled by. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind felt like a warning. When dawn finally broke, we packed up and left without a word. Back in town, we told our story to a local shopkeeper, an older woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable, and when we finished, she nodded. "You heard the Lady of the Lake," she said matter-of-factly. "Who?" Emma asked. The woman leaned on the counter, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Years ago, a young woman drowned in Bear Lake. Some say it was an accident. Others say it wasn't. Either way, she's still there, trapped beneath the ice. They say she sings to draw people in, to take them with her." We left the store in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on us. I couldn't shake the image of the ripple beneath the ice, the sound of that haunting song. Even now, years later, I can still hear it sometimes, in my dreams, in the quiet moments just before sleep. A melody filled with sorrow and longing, calling me back to the lake. I'll never return, but I know she's still there, waiting, her song echoing beneath the frozen surface, calling to anyone who dares to listen. Story number 4. Shadows in the snow. We needed a break. After months of grueling work schedules and the strain of daily life, my wife, Emily, and I decided to escape to Aspen for a long overdue getaway. The idea of a secluded cabin in the mountains sounded perfect. Crackling fires, snow-covered pines, and nothing but the quiet serenity of nature to recharge us. We found the cabin online, tucked away on a private property just outside Aspen. It looked charming in the photos. A cozy, rustic retreat with a stone fireplace, a large deck overlooking the forest, and plenty of privacy. The owner assured us it was well maintained, and the reviews were glowing. At first, everything was as idyllic as we'd hoped. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky ablaze with shades of orange and pink. The cabin was nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens that seemed to whisper in the gentle wind. Inside, it was warm and inviting, with polished wood floors, soft rugs, and the faint scent of cedar lingering in the air. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The silence was a welcome change from the constant hum of city life. By the time we climbed into bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. That peace didn't last. The first odd thing happened the next morning. Emily had gone to make coffee while I stayed in bed, enjoying the rare luxury of sleeping in. I heard her call my name, her voice laced with confusion. When I joined her in the kitchen, she was staring at the table, where one of the chairs had been moved halfway across the room. "Did you move this?" she asked. I shook my head. "Maybe it slid on the floor or something?" She gave me a doubtful look but let it go. We chalked it up to the uneven floors or some other mundane explanation. But as the day went on, more little things started to happen. A cabinet door we were sure we'd closed swung open on its own. The bathroom faucet dripped despite being tightly shut. And then there were the windows. That evening, as we were preparing dinner, we noticed the kitchen window was open. Snowflakes drifted in, melting instantly on the counter. "I thought we closed that," Emily said, frowning. "We did," I replied, closing it firmly and locking it for good measure. But later that night, as we settled in by the fire, we heard it, a faint creaking sound, followed by a soft thud. We turned toward the kitchen, and there it was again, the window, wide open, snowflakes swirling in the cold air. Emily's face turned pale. "I locked that," she whispered. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. The second night was worse. We went to bed uneasy, every creak and groan of the cabin setting us on edge. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, the settling of the old wood, but the pit in my stomach told a different story. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. They started in the hallway and moved closer, each step echoing in the stillness. My heart pounded as I reached for Emily, who was already awake, her wide eyes reflecting my fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The footsteps stopped outside our bedroom door. For what felt like an eternity, we held our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the doorknob rattled, the faint metallic clink sending a jolt of terror through me. The door didn't open, but the presence outside was palpable, an oppressive weight that pressed against my chest. We didn't sleep after that. When dawn finally broke, we left the bedroom cautiously, half expecting to find signs of an intruder. But the cabin was empty. The door was still locked, the snow outside untouched. We should have left then, but curiosity or stubbornness kept us there one more night. The third night was when we saw it. We went to bed early, hoping that the daylight would hold whatever was happening at bay. But at some point, I woke to the feeling of being watched. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the dim moonlight streaming through the window. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the flickering firelight, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else entirely. A figure stood at the foot of the bed, tall and unmoving. It was blacker than the surrounding darkness, a void that seemed to absorb the faint light around it. There were no discernible features, but the sheer malevolence it radiated was suffocating. Emily woke with a start, her gasp breaking the silence. The figure didn't move, but the temperature in the room dropped even further, the cold seeping into my bones. I grabbed her hand, and we bolted, not stopping until we were outside in the snow, the cabin looming behind us like a predator. We drove to town that night, our breaths ragged, our nerves frayed. We didn't say much, the shock too fresh. The next morning, I called the owner, demanding answers. He was reluctant to say much at first, but eventually, he admitted the truth. The cabin had a history. Decades ago, it had been the site of a gruesome murder-suicide. A man had killed his wife and 2 children before taking his own life. Since then, Every tenant had reported strange occurrences. Most left after just a few nights. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of that figure watching us. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up and swear I can feel the cold again. Hear the faint creak of footsteps on the floor. We never went back to Aspen, and we never stayed in another cabin again. Story number 5. The Stranger on the Trail. It was supposed to be a peaceful winter hike. My wife, Sarah, our daughter, Lily, and I had decided to spend a weekend in the Rockies, hoping to escape the noise of the city and breathe in the crisp mountain air. The Rocky Mountain National Park was magical in winter, snow-draped pines, ice-crusted streams, and a stillness that felt like stepping into another world. The day started perfectly. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the air carried that distinct, clean chill of winter. We bundled up in layers, packed a thermos of hot cocoa, and set off down one of the less-traveled trails. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the snow-packed path. Lily, who was 8 and endlessly curious, ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the trees. Sarah and I followed at a slower pace, our gloved hands clasped together. We talked about nothing in particular, enjoying the rare moment of tranquility. Then we saw him. He appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the trail about 20 yards ahead. An older man, maybe in his 70s, with silver hair and a thick mustache. His clothes struck me as odd, worn wool trousers, a long coat, and a battered fedora, like something out of a sepia-toned photograph. He carried a walking stick that looked hand-carved, its surface polished smooth by time. Lily stopped in her tracks, looking back at us with wide eyes. "Who's that?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice low. "But let's say hello." As we approached, the man turned to us with a polite smile. Close, I noticed his face was lined with deep creases, his skin weathered like old leather. His eyes were pale blue, almost translucent, and they seemed to flicker with something I couldn't quite place. "Good afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was calm, deliberate, with a faint accent I couldn't place. "I seem to have lost my way. Are you all right?" Sarah asked, concern flickering across her face. "It's awfully cold out here." The man chuckled softly. "Oh, I'm used to the cold. I was wondering if you might point me toward Blackburn Village." I frowned, the name not ringing any bells. Blackburn Village? I don't think that's anywhere around here. The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to dim slightly. "Oh, it's nearby," he said. "Just down the trail, I believe. You haven't heard of it?" Sarah and I exchanged a glance. "No," she said carefully. "We're not familiar with it." The man nodded, as though this answer didn't surprise him. "Well, thank you anyway. I should be going before the light fades." He tipped his hat again, smiled at Lily, and turned back the way we'd come. We watched him go, his figure disappearing around a bend in the trail. The moment he was out of sight, the forest seemed to breathe again, the air lighter somehow. Lily tugged at my hand. "Dad, where's Blackburn Village?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, pulling her close. "Probably just a place he remembers from a long time ago." Sarah looked uneasy. "Should we go after him? What if he's lost or confused?" I nodded, the same thought gnawing at me. We turned and walked back down the trail, our pace quickening as we followed his footprints in the snow. But after a few minutes, the tracks simply stopped. We froze, staring at the blank stretch of snow ahead. There were no other prints, no sign of where he could have gone. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered, her breath fogging the air. "He couldn't have just disappeared. Maybe he stepped off the trail," I offered weakly, though the unbroken snow around us said otherwise. Lily clung to my side, her small fingers digging into my coat. "Where did he go, Daddy?" "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. The rest of the hike back to the cabin was silent. The cheerful mood from earlier had dissolved into an oppressive unease that clung to us like the cold. That night, as the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the image of the man's pale eyes, the way they seemed to see something beyond us. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. While Sarah and Lily stayed behind at the cabin, I drove into town and asked around. Most people gave me blank looks when I mentioned Blackburn Village. One elderly man at the general store frowned and scratched his chin. Blackburn Village, you say? He murmured. Ain't heard that name in years. My pulse quickened. You've heard of it? He nodded slowly. My granddad used to talk about it. Said it was a little settlement up in the mountains. But it burned down. Oh, must have been over 100 years ago. Whole place went up in flames. No one survived. I felt a chill run through me. So it's gone. Long gone, he said, giving me a curious look. Why do you ask? I mumbled something about hearing the name in passing and left, my thoughts racing. The man we'd met couldn't have been looking for a place that hadn't existed in a century. And yet, that night, as the wind screamed through the trees and the cabin creaked under its weight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside, soft, deliberate, crunching through the snow. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, peeking out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then, just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood motionless. The man in the long coat and fedora. He lifted a hand, as if in farewell, and turned away, disappearing into the trees. By morning, his footprints were gone. We left the Rockies the next day, cutting our trip short. I never told Sarah or Lily what I'd seen that night, but the memory stays with me. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of those pale blue eyes, staring into mine, searching for something long lost. And I wonder if, in some way, that man is still walking the trails, looking for a village that time has erased but his soul refuses to forget. Story number 6. The cabin on Pikes Peak. We weren't supposed to be there. It started as a simple winter hike, a chance for me and my 3 friends to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. Pikes Peak was a challenge, sure, but we were experienced hikers. We'd planned everything meticulously, routes, gear, emergency supplies, but there's something about the mountains in winter, something unpredictable and ancient, that can unravel even the best laid plans. The snowstorm hit us hard and fast, a wall of white that swallowed the trail and forced us to a halt. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the wind cut through our layers like a knife. The temperature plummeted, and we knew we couldn't stay out there much longer. That's when we saw it. A cabin. It sat just off the trail, half buried in snow, the silhouette barely visible through the storm. The windows were dark, the roof sagging under the weight of years and weather. It didn't look inviting, but it was shelter. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Looks abandoned, Josh said, his breath fogging in the icy air. Does it matter? Sarah shot back, her voice sharp with panic. We can't stay out here. None of us argued. We trudged through the knee-deep snow, our boots crunching loudly in the stillness. The closer we got, the more the cabin seemed to loom, its warped wood and peeling paint like a relic from another time. The front door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing unnervingly in the empty space beyond. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. The cabin was small, just one room with a battered table, a couple of rickety chairs, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in years. There was no electricity, but the 4 of us had flashlights, their beams cutting through the gloom. This place gives me the creeps, Liz muttered, her eyes darting around the room. It's just a cabin, I said, more to convince myself than her. We'll stay the night and head out first thing in the morning. We piled our gear in a corner, spreading out our sleeping bags on the uneven wooden floor. Josh managed to get a small fire going in the fireplace, and the flickering light brought a semblance of warmth to the room. We ate in near silence, The storm howling outside started just after midnight. I was half asleep, the fire reduced to embers. When I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the cabin, it might as well have been a gunshot. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, my breath fogging in the freezing air. "Did you hear that?" Liz whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Josh said, already grabbing the flashlight. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The knock came again, more insistent this time. 3 sharp raps that sent a chill down my spine. "Who would be out here in this storm?" Sarah whispered, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her. Josh moved toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait, let's think about this." "Think about what?" he snapped. Someone could need help. But when he opened the door, there was no one there, just the storm, its icy breath swirling snow into the cabin. We shone the flashlight outside, but the beam revealed nothing, no tracks, no figure retreating into the darkness. "Probably an animal," Josh muttered, closing the door, but his voice lacked conviction. We tried to go back to sleep, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside, made my heart race. And then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the wind. Crunching footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. Sarah sat up, her face pale. "You hear that?" We all did. The sound circled the cabin, deliberate and unhurried, like someone or something was inspecting us. Josh grabbed the hatchet from his pack, his knuckles white as he gripped it. I moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. Nothing. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. Then the knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the cabin like a challenge. Sarah let out a small scream, and Liz clapped a hand over her mouth. Josh threw open the door, the hatchet raised. But the space outside was empty, just snow and shadows. And that's when we saw them, footprints. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin, circling it completely before stopping at the door. But they weren't normal footprints. They were too large. The toes splayed like claws, and there was no sign of any other tracks leading away. "What the hell made those?" Liz whispered, her voice barely audible. No one answered. We barricaded the door with the table and chairs, huddling together near the dying fire. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the real storm was the suffocating fear that settled over us like a blanket. None of us slept. When dawn finally broke, we emerged cautiously into the pale light of morning. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow over the mountain. But as we packed up and prepared to leave, something stopped us in our tracks. The door was covered in handprints. They were smeared across the wood, dark and wet, as though made by something dragging muddy fingers across the surface. But that didn't make sense. The ground outside was covered in snow. There was no mud to be found. We didn't talk as we descended the mountain, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of our boots in the snow. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear that knock in my dreams, feel the weight of unseen eyes watching us from the forest. We weren't supposed to be there, and whatever was out there that night, it wanted to make sure we knew it. Story number 7. Whispers in Room 217. When I booked a weekend at the Stanley Hotel, it wasn't because I was chasing ghosts. I'd heard the stories. Sure, everyone has. The grand old hotel in Estes Park, perched like a crown jewel against the rugged Rockies, was famous for its history and its hauntings. Stephen King had stayed here and dreamed up The Shining. But I wasn't looking for inspiration or a scare. I just needed a break, a quiet escape. I arrived late on a Friday evening, the winter wind biting at my face as I unloaded my suitcase. The Stanley was every bit as imposing as I'd imagined, its white facade gleaming against the dark backdrop of pine trees and snow. The lobby was warm and inviting, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Everything about it felt like a postcard come to life. The desk clerk, a cheerful woman with red curls pinned neatly under her cap, handed me my key with a smile. "Room 217, she said, her tone carrying a note of intrigue. "It's one of our most requested rooms." "Because of The Shining?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She laughed softly. "That, and the history. Let us know if you experience anything unusual." I chuckled nervously, brushing it off as part of the hotel's charm. Ghost stories sell rooms. After all, the walk to room 217 felt longer than it should have. The hallways were wide and quiet, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. The sconces on the walls cast a dim, amber glow, their light flickering just enough to make me wonder if the wiring was as old as the building. By the time I reached my door, a chill had settled over me, not from the cold, but from the odd stillness of the place. The room was everything I'd hoped for. Vintage charm with modern touches. A grand four-poster bed dominated the space, its heavy drapes framing crisp white linens. A clawfoot tub sat invitingly in the bathroom, and a small sitting area near the window offered a breathtaking view of the snow-covered mountains. It should have been perfect, but it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air in the room felt heavier than it should have, charged with something I couldn't name. I unpacked quickly, trying to ignore the creeping unease. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a hotel. An old one, sure, but still just a collection of rooms and hallways. Nothing more. Night came quickly, and with it, the wind. It howled around the building, rattling the windows and seeping through the cracks. I sat by the window, nursing a glass of complimentary sherry, and watched the snow fall in heavy, silent flakes. The world outside felt distant, muffled by the storm. And then, faintly, I heard it. Laughter. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, kids playing in the snow, perhaps. But as I listened, it became clear the sound was inside the hotel. High-pitched giggles, distant but unmistakable. I set my glass down, straining to hear. The laughter grew louder, echoing faintly from the hallway. I opened the door, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty. The laughter continued, distant and fleeting, like a melody carried on the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I followed it, my steps hesitant as I moved further down the hall. The sound led me to the grand staircase, its banisters polished to a gleam. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow flit past the landing below. But when I hurried down to investigate, there was nothing. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside, pressing against my ears. I turned back toward my room, unnerved but determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the faint creak of footsteps behind me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned. No one was there. Back in room 217. I locked the door and drew the heavy drapes closed. The wind outside had died down, but the air inside the room felt colder, as though the storm had seeped in. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of movement. It was subtle at first, like the rustle of fabric or the faint creak of a floorboard. I lay still, my heart pounding as I listened. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a soft, deliberate shuffling. It was coming from the foot of the bed. I sat up, the darkness pressing in around me. The room was eerily still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the clock on the nightstand. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. A woman, her silhouette framed by the faint outline of the window behind her. She was dressed in a flowing gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders in dark waves. Her face was pale and indistinct, but her eyes locked onto mine with a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was frozen. She took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with each step, frost forming on the windowpane behind her. She stopped at the foot of the bed, her gaze never wavering, and then she spoke. "Leave." Her voice was a whisper, barely audible but filled with an urgency that sent shivers down my spine. The word echoed in my mind, lingering long after her lips stopped moving. I blinked, and she was gone. The room was empty, the frost on the window already melting. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked out early, my hands trembling as I handed the key back to the desk clerk. Emily's cheerful smile faltered when she saw my face. "Everything all right?" she asked. I hesitated, then shook my head. I saw her. Emily's expression softened, a mixture of sympathy and something else, recognition. "Perhaps. You're not the first," she said quietly. "And you won't be the last." I left without another word, the hotel looming behind me like a specter as I drove away. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of her face, her voice, or the unshakable feeling that I was intruding on something ancient and restless. The Stanley Hotel may be beautiful, but it's not a place where the past stays buried. And some spirits, it seems, never rest.